Hello everyone and welcome to today's stream on GraphQL where we are joined by Mr. Chathu Vishwajith, who is a ambassador at Auth0 as well as a country representative for Unity Technologies. So he'll be filling us in on how we can actually get started with GraphQL and how we can actually work our way to its very top. So if you are interested, tune in and let me quickly hand over the stream to Mr. Chathu. So hi Mr. Chathu, the stream is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So we are going to talk about GraphQL today. Let's see how it's going to work for us. So I'm going to talk about mostly about introduction into GraphQL. So it's we actually say that's GraphQL. It's actually graph query language. So let's move on. As he said that I'm Chathu Vishwajith. I'm also an ambassador, and I do an co-founder in a startup, and I do organize kind of JavaScript meetup with Pasindu. You can find me. I am Chathu at most of the social media. So what is GraphQL? That's the question. So I will give you a proper definition first, then I will try to explain it. So GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries. So it has two phases. So first one is called, it's a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries. Okay, I'm going to explain it anyway. So let's move on to the other slides and I'm trying to explain this definition. So what is GraphQL? So it's a specification. So it's a set of way of handling things. So it has a kind of a documentation. So it's kind of a specification. This we are defined how to do things according to the GraphQL. So it's not an implementation actually. GraphQL actually a specification where to do it, and it's open source. The specification is open source, and most of the tools that give the support to GraphQL, building APIs or fulfilling that queries, or any other things like querying the GraphQL client. So all are actually most of them are open source. There are most of them are community-driven projects. And the specification is created by GraphQL. GraphQL actually born in Facebook, and they try to use it, and later they made the specification open source and let the community get a consumption of that one and move ahead with it. So the specification is actually getting updated with community help, other things from the input from the other companies who are using GraphQL. And there are multiple implementation of this specification. The one prominent is actually Apollo. They were in the beginning of the GraphQL, in the inception, and there are many other people who behind these implementations. It's actually based on a thing called declarative data fetching. I'm going to talk about more on this topic. What is actually declarative data fetching? And it has support to get many resources from one request. So you can fulfill most of your resources that you want on a one request. And GraphQL is a strongly typed and is a way of exposing resources from a service, and not only a way of managing database. There will be some kind of confusion when you see most of the tutorials that actually has fetching data from a database to as a GraphQL layer, but actually GraphQL doesn't lock itself on this kind of querying database. It's a, as I said in the definition, it's a way of querying and any kind of resource. So in here you can actually use another services also, not only a database. Let's see what I said earlier. So this is the big picture of GraphQL. So as you can see, this is actually the image I got from Apollo. So it has an Apollo icon in the middle. Just take it as a GraphQL server. So it's kind of a GraphQL endpoint, which actually under the hood, it actually uses a REST API or a microservice or a database. It's up to you. You can choose where you actually get the data, and it resolves using a one endpoint, and where you can actually query data from web client or a mobile client or the way you want. There are many clients for each platforms. And another use case is actually you can have multiple services communicating from different clients, and you expose some of your APIs to other third-party apps also. And so this is going to be a kind of a messy situation where you have multiple services, and where you can simplify is using one graph endpoint, and you use the services underlying as the way of resolving the graph. And there will be only one phase where you use the simplified GraphQL layer, and you can access this with multiple clients. So why GraphQL? Why actually we had many ways of fulfilling APIs. GraphQL came into picture because Facebook had a kind of issues, because you can see that Facebook database is kind of very big, and when they're opening that API data to third-party tools and developers, they had to create a way of doing it. So first they tried to get a way of doing it with REST APIs, which kind of become a documentation nightmare because they had to open many endpoints. Later they moved to a way of called Facebook Graph, which later became GraphQL. So using that Facebook Graph, the developers can actually use a single API key with the permissions, and according to that permission, you can query the Facebook data. Also, Facebook had issue when it comes to mobile clients, because whenever you going to request a single resource, it's going to give you, even let's take an example where you want to get one book detail or one friend a profile, only a profile, but only you want to get the name. But to get that name, you need to call the profile endpoint, and which gives you the profile picture, the array of friends, and the first name, last name, and everything that you actually don't want, which make the response kind of a bigger in a kind of data incentive. So why that Facebook tend to explore other options that you can come up to reduce that amount of data. So I'm not good in drawing, but I try to create a little bit of drawing myself, trying to explain you the APIs. So this is a REST API. I use a book API. So it has an endpoint called books, which returns an array of books, and inside it has an author ID. I hope you can see it. Cool. So it has an author ID. So if you want to get the author name, you have to request the author's endpoint with the ID and get an object with all the information about the authors. So currently you want to display it in the kind of a carousel where you want to have a book name and author name, just and these two properties, but still you have to send multiple requests to get the book array, and each of that books you need to send another request for the ID and get the name. Even though you only need the author's name, you will get all the author information, also the other book information where you don't want. So this make about let's say you have 5 books with 3 authors. You have to send one request to get all the books and another 3 requests to get the author details. So after that, your page is going to render the details. So let's see how this is going to be simplified with GraphQL. So I changed the book API to books GraphQL endpoint. Sorry, now this is my drawing. So in GraphQL, you only have one endpoint. You can see this part where I have the request. So in request, I just send a JSON object where I say that books. I will explain what are these. So in the books section, I give that I need name, and author, and author is also an object. So I only need name of the author. And when I send the request, the response will be another object where books then requested operation name. Books will have an array of another object with the exact definition that I sent, which we call declarative data fetching. We declare the data we want the way we want, and the server will be respond with the exact structure that we requested. So this is the REST versus GraphQL, a more structured way than my drawing. So in the REST client, to get an album ID and assets, you have to request this endpoint, and to get each comment, you have to request for each asset for all the comments. So you can see that you need to request multiple requests to get all data that you want. But in a GraphQL client, you just need to request the asset with an album ID, and you get the comments as array also. So you can see that you don't get the additional information you actually doesn't need, and also the amount of requests that you send to the server also get down. So this is an information that you can find it in GraphQL.org. So you can describe the data. That's how you're going to create an GraphQL endpoint. First, you need to describe your data, the data type of the data, and then you can actually ask for the properties. We call these actually as queries or mutations. I'm going to explain it in future slides. So this is kind of operation that you can do on the GraphQL, and you will get the predicted results. So you request a project name GraphQL, and you only need the tagline. So you will get the tagline of that requested property. So this is the previous one with a more kind of useful way than my drawing. So you can see that GraphQL is kind of interesting, and which reduce the workload. So as a formal comparison, REST API has many endpoints based on the resources. And to use a resource, you actually use resource plus HTTP method like get, post, put, or delete with the HTTP methods. And the shape of the size of the response defined by the server. So you just request the resource you want, and the resource structure is defined by the server. So multiple requests need to send to retrieve relational data. So if you have one data related to other, you need to send more requests to get each of this relational data. And in GraphQL, you only have one URL endpoint. Most of the time we use post request, and for some of the read operations, we can use get endpoint and make it cached by a CDN. This kind of advanced topic we can discuss later, but mostly you will send a post request, and the response shape is defined inside a request by the user. So you define the way you want the response to need to be based on a schema that we define, and you can almost retrieve the relational data from a single query. And let's talk about the types, the strongly typed GraphQL. So GraphQL is strongly typed. It has the main types as scalar and object types. So the built-in scalar types will be like, we have string type, we have float, we have int, and ID, which is actually kind of telling the unique string. This ID is used by the GraphQL client to do an caching. So where you can actually build an caching in the front end for your client. So you don't need to send same request again and again. You can define a TTL and use that cache instead of sending more and more requests again and so forth to the server. And it also have a Boolean type, and it has object types which actually custom shapes with this field that had either scalar or object types. So it's a kind of a combination of scalar types. And also you can have your own scalar types defined based on the language you're actually going to implement GraphQL. It may differ, but there's a good documentation for each languages. You can use that one to create a customized scalar types. And there are other types that we call query and mutation. So these two are actually operations that you can perform. Previous one, that is the types we talked about, scalar and the object types, they actually define the response, what kind of a response you can accept. In these types, the query and mutation, they actually define the operation. You can query, you can mutate. So in simple terms, it's actually CRUD for your API. So queries are actually read data from the source. It's basically anything that doesn't mutate your data. So if you can identify if it is going to be mutation or if it is going to be query by if it is going to change something in the server or data, it's going to be a mutation. If it doesn't change anything after that operation, it's going to be a query. So it's a query, just the name is optional arguments that eventually return a type. So query is a kind of operational name. It can have arguments that eventually return a type. So it need to be a return something. And mutation, same like query, which means it has a name and it can have argument. It executes an operation which is going to be change the resource. It might return a value or it might not. Query and mutation things are people interact with the GraphQL service. Also, there's another type which is not going to talk about in this session since it is an introduction. We also have a subtype type where you can actually have a PubSub kind of thing in GraphQL where you can actually have real-time updated queries and mutations. And let's look at a demo. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the demo first moving forward. Demo will be hosted in GitHub, so you can have a look later after this session. So I'm going to choose language. We are going to use Node.js, and as a language, we are going to use TypeScript. And there are few libraries actually going to help us with this demo, and they are not kind of way of I'm enforcing you need to use that ones. There are other plenty of community driven projects that are available, and also company back projects available, so you can use them and the documentation from them too. This is the one I normally use, so I'm going to kind of do a demo on that one. Later we come to other slides. So for now, let's go to the code. Before moving forward, so I will going to serve you the structure. Let's try to zoom in, but it doesn't let me do the zoom. Let's try to do the zoom in again. Okay, I'm just going to close the code and get it back. Waiting was so hard. So I'm doing the stream with 2 monitor setup, so I think kind of slow down the device. I actually closed one of the application I'm currently using, but seems Chrome, which I used to do the presentation, and the one using for the stream actually eating my RAM. Let's see if I can open the VS Code again. I need to wait since Chrome is still hang on. Yes, try to keep wait and
Hi, Mr. Chathu.
opening.
Hello. Yeah, so in the meantime, while this loads, we have a question, I guess, in the chat. So maybe while this loads, we can respond to some of those questions. Will that be okay? I guess
I did
you're breaking up.
get you. Yeah. Is it
You're not audible.
in my internet connection,
Wait, let me switch off my
or how is
camera.
it?
I don't know.
Do you getting me
Let me switch off
correctly,
my
or
camera and see.
you are losing me?
It's okay now, I guess. I am audible, right? I think we lost it again.
No, I'm hearing you. Good. I think, yeah.
I think
You're
there's a
audible,
delay,
and how
like
about me?
around 2 seconds delay. Yeah, you're audible, but there's around a 2 second delay.
Okay, seems my internet connection is not that good today.
No worries, it's the same with all of us.
But still, I'm waiting for VS Code to load.
Yeah, so in the
So
meantime, yeah,
until we get it load, I think we can answer a few of the questions.
that's great, I guess. So let me share one with you. How about this one? Can we use GraphQL as an alternative for WebSocket as its pub/sub feature?
Yeah.
Okay, let me switch my camera. I guess we have a delay.
It's not an alternative, but we can use for the pub/sub means you can actually subscribe to your queries and client. Like if you are using it in a React front end and you do a subscription on the GraphQL query, it's going to be reflected immediately. But it actually uses WebSocket as an transport So underlyingly for the subscription feature, it will be using WebSockets. And since you are using the WebSocket on top of GraphQL, the API will be more simplified and you don't need to touch any WebSocket commands.
Got it.
I think I got it still loading this code. Do you have any questions, other questions who actually had an issue when I doing the presentation?
Nothing actually from my side. How about the audience? Like, anyone open for any questions?
Yeah. So GraphQL is currently used by many organizations, including GitHub. Facebook is they were there, and there are other organizations who actually use GraphQL. So most of the projects that we also do currently is actually GraphQL. Actually, almost all projects that we did recently was GraphQL. And since I said that GraphQL is strongly typed and it has kind of a tooling from community, so actually since it's strongly typed, we can actually generate the documentation on the fly on top of the GraphQL layer. So you don't need to have another kind of documentation tool to create for each and operation that you are going to support and the mutation that you have. Like in REST APIs where you need to create a kind of a Swagger or anything, Open API spec things to do the API documentation. The GraphQL is actually creating its own documentation when you do the typing. Let's see if we can work around in here. I still can show me. Okay, seems getting to me. No. Still activating the extensions.
No worries. Let's give it a little bit more time. We actually have one more question. Shall we maybe have a look into that as well?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So, Sitam is asking, what are the pros and cons of GraphQL if we use it for BFF? I'm not sure what BFF stands for, and I'm not sure it's best stands for you, right? Could you like elaborate what BFF stands for?
That's the, yeah, Situng, can you actually give me an idea of BFF? I got the PNC. So you got the pros anyway. So cons will be that you have to create the resolvers. So you're going to resolve these queries. And cons, the GraphQL, you need a kind of extra setup or extra knowledge how to set up caching on top of the queries. Yeah, the cons, I think the cons that you need to work on extra effort to make it cacheable. Apart from that, almost every other thing is actually pros. That I mentioned that you can actually get the data that in declarative manner and reduce the number of of requests that send when you're loading a page. So initial load, if you don't need to send multiple requests to get the data to your front end. Instead, you can actually send in one request with multiple operation inside it. And other con will be that if you have a long GraphQL request object, it kind of increase the request size that is sent to the server, and you can actually do any limitations on the operation that can allow each for each request is possible, and that will be needed if you have very result insensitive operations. If I get an example where you have a kind of a multiple relations, and if you're going to open it like an complete tree, where you open, let's say you have author, and inside author you have another property, and you open it and you try to get another relation which is going to be attached to that one. So it is going to be a kind of a chain of things, and it needs to be resolved one by one, and which make kind of a server hang of it and kind of a server load. So in this area you will be needed to think how to reduce these ones and make it very fast, like using and caching in between, or in GraphQL we have a property thing called GraphQL data loaders, where it can actually maintain its own caching in a graph manner.
Shatu, maybe
Let's
like,
try to
shall we try
zoom it
switching off
again.
your camera? Maybe it could improve your connection a little.
Be looking now. Hope so.
Shall we try that out? Wait. And I think we got the response for what BFF was, backend for front end.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of increase the font size, but seems it is not saving to my settings.
No, it's okay. Let me like
You still
switch
cannot
the
see it.
layout.
Okay.
Let me like switch to a
Still.
full layout. Okay, should be good now.
Yeah, let's see.
Great.
Okay, I'm trying to turn it off now. Yeah. Okay, let's see how it's work after the camera.
Yeah. It seems it's better now, right? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Next time. Okay, sorry for that thing that's going to be messing around. These things sometimes got to work when I'm doing streaming.
No worries. We all have our bad days, right?
It's kind of a responding now. Let's see.
how about we do something like this? Let's see if we have any more questions, and
Yeah.
let's maybe like continue with the discussion since the screen share doesn't seem to be
I'm
work.
going to switch off
Maybe like
my
we could.
external monitor, and let's try to do it in the single monitor setup.
Okay, great. That'll work as well.
Yeah, sure. And
Great.
still,
I guess it's visible.
I think VS Code is still loading. That's the problem. It doesn't identify the
Oh,
this is a JSON file. You can see
hmm?
it's still white.
Yeah.
So if I explain that anyway, so I have dependencies called Apple Server Core and Apple Server Express. So these two are from Apple organization. These are very good battle tested GraphQL servers, which actually implemented all of the GraphQL specification, including subscription and all the queries and resolvers. And I'm using something called type GraphQL. Since TypeScript actually has some good support on type system, you can use same types system using TypeScript to make things very simpler with the GraphQL. So type GraphQL is kind of a library which is written top of GraphQL, and it gives a TypeScript support to the GraphQL to be used with Apollo server. And Express is a very common library that we use to create HTTP servers. And GraphQL is a library from the GraphQL specification. And Helmet is actually a tool that we use for doing more security on Express. .env is a library that we use to load env values from a file. And I use dependencies to run the dev server using TS node, and we use TypeScript. So these are the dependencies. I hope it's kind of visible. Let's try to do a zoom again. No, still doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to this repo is currently open source, and it is in private. So I will be going to make it public after this session, so you can actually have a look around it. And I wanted to add few options to it, but I will do the commit later on the options that I want to do it in live. So let's move to the remaining slides, and let's try to get Q&A going and do a kind of a discussion.
Yeah, that'll be wonderful.
Okay. Do we got any questions currently? Okay, let's see. Okay, so I'll give you a kind of an summary that I discussed. So we discussed about GraphQL. So GraphQL is kind of a specification created by Facebook, and it's kind of open source, and it used to way of querying APIs, and it has a runtime to resolve it. So it's actually have a kind of a declarative data fetching, so where you can actually define the response that the way you want, and you can get it from one request, and it will only have one endpoint, not like REST where you have multiple endpoints for each resource. In GraphQL, you will only have one endpoint, and you can request the data the way you want, and it will be responding with that data.
Got it. That was actually a wonderful session, I guess, and it was a truckload of information which you filled us in it, right? And even though we had a little bit of technical difficulties, I believe that almost all of it was really interesting, like interesting to very cool. And I believe that the audience feels the same. Like GraphQL, it's really scary. Like for me, the word graph used to scare me like since around school days. So I believe like after the session, I'm like kind of okay with it, and I feel like exploring GraphQL a little bit more further. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Wait,
I
I'm
guess.
going to show the summary again.
Oh yeah,
So I
great.
managed to open the summary.
Okay, let me.
So do you get it?
Yeah, I got it.
Cool. So as I said, this is a specification, and it's open source, created by Facebook, and it has multiple implementations. It has implementation for Go, Java, and it also has implementation for C Sharp, and obviously JavaScript and TypeScript. And I think there's a implementation for Rust also. So you can use the language you prefer and find an library that is help to create a GraphQL server. And if you're going to use a GraphQL in the front end, there are plenty of tools. Like from Apollo, it has Apollo client, and there's something called URQL, and there are GraphQL request is the simplest modest library where you can use to request and query data from GraphQL. And it has a declarative data fetching, so you can declare the way you want for the response to be, and you can get data out of it. And you can get many resources in one request, so you can combine multiple request queries in one request, and you can get the complete data set out of the way you declared. And it has types, so you define the types which will be helpful when you request in the data. So the server will be do the type kind of validations on that the types you define. And GraphQL is a way of exposing resource from a service. So you can actually use a GraphQL layer top of an existing REST API or existing another microservice. Or you can actually directly get the data out of your database. So each of these things are possible. And I will be open sourcing the project that I try to open in this URL. So you can actually clone it, and I will be putting a README how to run it and see it for yourself and try it out. If you have any questions, you can actually find me in social channels and just ping me. I will be happy to help.
Yeah, that
And
sounds really awesome.
that's all for.
Great. So
And
I believe we don't have any questions. Are there any? If there is anyone willing to ask? No, I guess. So again, thank you for joining with us,
and
and
thank you very
especially
much for inviting me.
yes, well, you're welcome. So again, I think we can wrap up for today then, right? So see you.
Yeah.